right, good morning and thank you for joining us. My name is Christine Ingram. I'm the local interest librarian here at the new Hanover County Public Library. Today's program is part of Dwell with Gratitude and Pride, New Perspectives on the Wilmington Campaign. We have with us from Fort Fisher State Historic Site, Becky and Kaitlin, to discuss how soldiers and civilians responded to news of the Wilmington Campaign during the Civil War, and how our understanding of these events have transformed over time. Becky is the collections manager and exhibit coordinator for Fort Fisher State Historic Site. With her 20 plus years of working with the North Carolina Historic Sites Division, Becky has worked at Bentonville Battleground and Fort Fisher. She's worked with the Civil War Trails program at Bentonville, curated battlefield wayside panels at both sites, and has curated several of the temporary exhibits at Fort Fisher. Kaitlin is a public historian at Fort Fisher State Historic Site. She's particularly interested in African-American history and public programming to share those stories. At Fort Fisher, Kaitlin serves as the Education and Outreach Coordinator. She earned her bachelor's in history and will soon complete her master's in public history, both from NC State University. Please help me welcome Becky and Kaitlin.
Well, good morning, and thank you for coming out this morning for our presentation. This speaker's presentation is part of our new programming series entitled 12 with Gratitude and Pride, New Perspectives on the Wilmington Campaign. And we partnered with the New Hanover County Library to host speakers and with the Cameron Art Museum for tours. And we have brochures available if you're interested. The goal of this series is to expand our understanding of what happened here in the Civil War and to commemorate the forced and free contributions of all sorts of people to the campaign. So we're used to hearing about Confederates and white Union soldiers, who is comprised of the bulk of the fighting force in the campaign. This series will highlight Asian, Hispanic, Black, and Indigenous Americans as well. For us to really understand what happened here in the past, and how it impacts us today, we really need to wrestle with these diverse perspectives and experiences of the past. If we really wanted to truly understand what happened at your last family Thanksgiving dinner, I would only be able to do that if I talked to everybody there. So what historians do, we explore the past from diverse perspectives and to work to put those narratives together, and that's what the series is all about. And Kaitlin's done a really great job and putting this together, so I applaud her. So today, my colleague and I are talking about the changing memory of the Wilmington Campaign. For the past 5 years, Americans have heard a lot of debates about history, and we've seen some tension about changing history and what that means and who we are as a nation. So we wanted to pause today to really dig into how and why our understanding of the past evolves. We're going to explore how different people in the past 158 years thought about and commemorate the Wilmington Campaign. We also want to acknowledge that this can be a controversial and difficult topic for people. And that is very true. And that it's okay. Thank you for coming out today and learning with us. And if you have any questions, we're happy to address those at the end. First. Okay. Thank you. There we go. So the first draft of history, the official records of the War of the Rebellion and newspaper reports. So during the American Civil War, official documents such as after-action reports and newspapers were key in recording the events that happened during the American Civil War. The idea of the official records came from Union General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, who apparently was overwhelmed by the task of writing his 1863 annual report to Congress. Halleck recommended to the Committee of Military Affairs the collection and publication of official documents and reports on all Civil War operations. It was passed through the Senate, and it became a resolution on May 19, 1864. Abraham Lincoln signed the bill into law the next day. Officially titled The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of official records of the Union and Confederate armies, The official records are compiled in 127 volumes, plus a general index and accompanying atlas. These were published in 1888. They serve as a primary source material for researchers and historians. But as a word of caution must be made here about the value and limitations of the ORs, as we like to call it. So if you talk to somebody and say the ORs, they're referring to the official records. As a primary source material, the official records are without question the most complete and impartial documentation of the American Civil War. They provide a foundation for serious research into virtually every aspect of the war. And we use them today at our site. So if we're doing research about part of the battle or something like that, we pull the ORs and we look at it. But on the other hand, no study of the American Civil War should rely exclusively on the official records. The accounts contained in the ORs were not edited for accuracy, and due to space considerations, only excerpts of reports were often included. Researchers should thus verify their information and so forth. Newspapers provided valuable information to the civilian population regarding the war. They would print casualty lists as well as maps showing the details of battles. Northern newspapers reveled in the fact that Fort Fisher had been captured. And as you can see here, it made the front page news of the New York Herald on January 18th. That included a map of Wilmington and the Cape Fear District. And the New York Times prints the capture on the front page as well, but on January 19th. While Southern newspapers such as the Wilmington Journal and the Richmond Dispatch write about it and publish the demise of Fort Fisher to pages 2 and 3. The Wilmington Journal prints on page 2 on January 19th, 4 days after the battle, while the Richmond Dispatch prints on page 3 on January 17th, only 2 days after the battle. Okay, so as you can see, they're just giving brief reports about it. And what's interesting about the Wilmington Journal, they give a casualty list of about 52 wounded received in Southport, which were eventually sent up to Wilmington. In the post-war, there would be arguments among the commanding generals who were at Fort Fisher, and this came to blow between General Ames and General Curtis in 1897. At a banquet at the Loyal Legion in New York, there was this basically conflict between the two of them of who did what, who was the hero of Fort Fisher. And they were quoted as they were frowning at each other as, quote, as a land battery can frown at a hostile fleet, making a reference to Fort Fisher. Ames made himself to be the hero of Fort Fisher and belittled the role of Curtis had in the battle. Ames basically stated that Curtis's title, the quote, hero of Fort Fisher, was unearned and undeserved, and that the famous charge that is claimed by Curtis was actually done by Captain A.G. Lawrence, who was the first into the fort and actually was killed. Curtis, who did lose an eye at the Battle of Fort Fisher, that's why they give him the title of hero of Fort Fisher. Now it's Kaitlin's turn.
All right, so now we're going to transition to Reconstruction and how people started to commemorate the war in its aftermath. So if you're not familiar, Reconstruction really takes place from 1865 to 1877. And so here's a depiction, if you will, of the Wilmington Old Market House, which is on the corner of Front and Market Streets. And so before the Civil War, this is really commonplace to trade goods, agricultural goods, maybe some homemade goods. And of course, this is also a place where human beings were exchanged in the slave trade. And so after the war, the Wilmington Market House becomes really cornerstone for celebrations among the local African-American community and Unionists. For example, on January 1st, 1866, local Black people celebrated an Emancipation Proclamation for the first time. You're unaware the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. So this would be the 3rd year anniversary, but the first one after the Civil War, the first one where everyone in Wilmington was living as a free person. So it was a really big deal. There was public parades with speakers, people were carrying signs, and their march included a walk around Front and Market streets around the old market house. So at this spot, just about everyone in the crowd could have been sold like cattle here. They are quite literally celebrating their freedom, shouting and cheering, and commemorating the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the war. 1866 is not likely the first time that Wilmingtonians celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation. Historians tell us that throughout the Confederate-held South, enslaved people would celebrate. They just couldn't do it openly until after the war for fear of the enslavers. But these celebrations continue from 1866 well into the early 20th century here in town. And so what we see at these celebrations, what we saw at this very first one in 1866 and most of them afterwards, is that the Black people here in Wilmington are marrying their celebrations of emancipation and freedom with ongoing efforts for equality and citizenship. That very first parade in 1866 called for voting rights and civil rights among the formerly enslaved. We also see veterans organizations pop up. For example, this one is from August of 1866, where prominent Black North Carolinians across the state are attempting to organize a veterans league for Black sailors and soldiers. And their mission was really clear. They wanted to continue to push for freedom and democracy. They said it is our duty to combine and to connect ourselves together, that we may at this present, as well as in the future, preserve our great blessings, the ballot box, as we did with the United States muskets. So we have several dozen Black veterans who settle in Wilmington after the war. And for them, Civil War memory was really about commemorating, yes, sacrifices in battle, and yes, the emancipation, but it's also about continuing to push for further progress. And we see that also with Union veterans here in Wilmington. For example, Decoration Day is when Union veterans, Unionists across the South and North commemorate the war dead. It's an early precursor of Memorial Day. And so Decoration Day in Wilmington, 1870, the former Union Major J.C. Mann spoke to a crowd of veterans in the Grand Army of the Republic, an organization for Union veterans to pay tributes to all the sacrifices made in the Wilmington Campaign. And Mann claimed that the Union soldiers fought for the preservation of their nation and to preserve the ideals of freedom and liberty. At the start of the war, these principles is really what Union soldiers are fighting for. They're fighting to preserve the United States, yes, but it's not just loyalty for the sake of loyalty. They believe in those principles wholeheartedly and fight to preserve that along with territory. And so they go to war with that, but as they're campaigning through the South, they see time and time again enslaved people in the bondage and realize that this is a clear hypocrisy to have a land of freedom and personal liberty with people held in bondage. So that's why we see white soldiers overwhelmingly support President Lincoln in the 1864 election, and they push for emancipation and abolition as part of the war, and are really excited about the official adoption of that policy in 1863. And so they continue to commemorate that in their post-war celebrations. So back here in Wilmington in 1870, former Union Major Mann is actually paying special tribute to the Black soldiers in the Wilmington Campaign, which is actually fairly common for white Union veterans to do and union organizations to do in the very early years after the war. He said, "Here too lie colored troops who dared to fight in the land where they were outlawed for liberty of their race. If it required bravery for us to march at the cannon's mouth, how much more did it require of them, knowing as they did that they were denied the rights of civilized warfare and that their capture was worse than death?" He refers here to a Confederate order where U.S. colored troops would be enslaved rather than treated as POWs, and their officers would be executed. But with all of this before them and the diabolical outrages of Fort Pillow in their minds, they still dared and did their whole duty. How little did any of us suppose when the stars and stripes were raised over Fisher, that in 3 short years, colored men, then slaves, would vote in this land and be entitled to all the rights of citizenship. And here, side by side with Northern men as they fought, calmly sleep colored heroes who freely gave up their lives that you might be known as men among men. So not across the board, but for a lot of white Union veterans, it really is a commemoration of this unified purpose of fighting for liberty and freedom and really acknowledging the contributions of U.S. colored troops and U.S. sailors. He's talking specifically about the U.S. colored troops who gave up their lives in the Wilmington Campaign and the war more broadly here. You see that echo sentiment throughout his speech. And man really does wish that both Northerners and Southerners, regardless of race or wealth, will live in harmony after the war. But for him, he stressed that the war, as the war faded further into history, that, quote, "one truth was ever plain, and this we must understand unerringly, that the foe we fought was treason, and teach faithfully to our children. Our struggle was for national life, our country, and our whole country. We were loyal to our flag and to our country, and to the principle which was the foundation stone." So like I said, for Mann and other Union veterans in Wilmington, that principle really is liberty, not loyalty for loyalty's sake, but the preservation of those great American ideals that we all hold sacred. And throughout Reconstruction, we also have another group of people here in Wilmington trying to make sense of what just happened. The South has lost a tremendous amount of wealth, of property, of damage to fields, and of course, the end of slavery is both an economic burden and a psychological burden to many white Southerners who really identify with this system of living. And so that really requires some justification. How do I go back into this American family when I just lost a war and that people are calling treason? So in 1866, Edward Pollock publishes a book called The Lost Cause, but really has a title as long as the first page of his book. But we'll call it The lost cause today. That's the shorthand title. And this lost cause, which we understand today, the lost cause was a undocumented reasoning for why the South lost the war. It's a justification that the South did not fight for slavery, but even if they did, Pollock explains, slavery was a benevolent institution. And actually, Black people were better off enslaved, he would argue, than they were free. And he points to poverty among free people as part of his reasoning for that, let alone the fact that they were not given any supports when they were emancipated. So Pollock comes up with these ideas, not just to justify slavery, but also to elevate Southern position. So he equates the Southern ideals, which were so clearly before the war about preserving slavery, says that they fought against tyranny, like American revolutionaries did, and that they were brothers in arms combating each other and worthy of just as much honor and glory as the Union veterans. And so this idea of the lost cause really gains traction throughout the South. It's really a way to comprehend what just happened without having to reconcile with the harsh truth of slavery. And so we see here in Wilmington in 1870, I believe this paper came out. Lost my spot in my note. Yeah, in 1870, the Wilmington Journal published calls for locals to celebrate the Confederacy and the lost cause. I understand this is a good way of justifying themselves, of reuniting and feeling good about who they are and what they stood for. He said, if we forget the lost cause, the Wilmington Journal wrote, we forget the principles of which it was the offspring. Its memories we need not be ashamed of. Its glories we may well be proud of. So they're calling not just for justification, or excuse me, not just to celebrate the bravery and sacrifices of the soldiers, but for those very principles that Old South was founded upon, that great truth that their nation was founded upon slavery. In fact, just after the fall of Fort Fisher in January 1865, one North Carolina paper reiterated that truth, that the war was fought over slavery. They said, the abolition doctrine is the very doctrine which the war was commenced to put down. All right. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Becky.
Glory enough for all, but was it really? Reunions between Fort Fisher veterans began as early as 1875 in Wilmington, in which Colonel William Lamb attended. Talks of a reunion in 1901, but it never came to fruition. And reunions did occur in August of 1903 in Wilmington, January of 1907 in Wilmington, then in 1909 in Utica, New York. Final efforts for a reunion in 1914 were mentioned, but never came to be. In August of 1903, a reunion was held in Wilmington, and quote, the only Yankee who attended was the former Navy Captain James Parker, who had married into the Darosset family. He was the only one invited. Ironically enough, some of these veterans who attended did not fight at Fort Fisher, but were part of Hoke's division at Sugarloaf, and then there were some who were just a Confederate veteran and they lived in Wilmington, and so they decided to attend. These two are from the Wilmington Messenger in August of 1903. This is a full spread paper about reliving the Battle of Fort Fisher. They list the units that were involved and also the Navy vessels as well. The other one, is just talking about the address made by Governor Aycock at the time, Colonel William Lamb of Norfolk, James Parker of New Jersey, and some other man, Eugene Martin, who I do not know who he is. But this is just, again, just a Confederate themed reunion. And because of that reunion, they start talking about Fort Fisher maybe becoming what becomes a national park. Or during that time, they were called reservations. The efforts were talked among the veterans, including General Newton Martin Curtis, who this one piece of paper is from. It's his signature. He talks about maybe mentioning it to members of Congress. In the 1890s, some of the Civil War battlefields become, quote, reservations, and eventually would become the basis of the National Park Service. The first 4 battlefields are preserved by the nation were not selected at random, but constituted almost from the beginning. And the Army War College pointed out later that these national parks were designed by Congress both to preserve the last major battlefields for historical and professional study, and also to serve as lasting memorials to the great armies of the war on both sides. So the first 4 that were established was 1890, which was Chickamauga, Chattanooga. 1894 was Shiloh. 1895 was Gettysburg, and 1899 was Vicksburg. So with these 4 that were established, by 1903, it makes sense for them to push for Fort Fisher to become a national, a reservation. In 1907, another reunion took place in Wilmington, and this time Union veterans were invited. Most of the Northern veterans were either of the 112th and 117th New York and the 12th New York Volunteers. At this reunion, General Curtis and Colonel Lamb both attended. A reunion pin was distributed among the veterans seen here, glory enough for all. But again, it can be noted that Black veterans were not part of this reunion, so was it really glory enough for all? Again, another push for Fort Fisher to be a part. And that is the reunion pin that was distributed at the reunion. And this is actually a little blurb in the Wilmington newspaper describing that pin. Like I mentioned, was it glory enough for all? And as far as we can tell, Black veterans were not invited to the reunions for Fort Fisher veterans. The first reunion was held in 1883 in New York that was invited Black veterans. So as you can see here, this is a newspaper account from one of the New York newspapers that says that the first annual reception and reunion of the colored veteran soldiers and sailors to be held in the city. And so again, it's separate. It's not, they're not included into the reunion. And that's probably part of the reason in Wilmington, you had the 1898 massacre. So would colored veterans want to come to Wilmington? Would they want to come back to an area that probably is not hospitable? We don't know if they attended the 1909 reunion up in New York. But again, it's interesting to see that they're separated and they're not part of, you know, the New York veterans coming down. It's, again, a separate thing. And now it's Kaitlin's turn.
All right, bring you back up here so there's more easy history. Okay, so as Becky's talking about, all of these reunions are happening at the turn of the century. This is also when we start to see a lot of Confederate monuments pop up. So we talked a little shakily in the first bit about the lost cause going out throughout the South as a way to reconcile their rebellion and make it something more digestible for the majority of American people. And so one way you look to do that is to put your memory in stone, your message in stone. So we start to see Confederate monuments pop up here in town. And I'm just gonna highlight a few and what the people who dedicated these monuments and fought for these monuments really thought when they were going up. So we'll look at two. We'll look at the 1872 monument in Oakdale Cemetery first. And so for years, Confederates, former Confederates rather, gathered at Oakdale Cemetery here in town on May 10th for Confederate Memorial Day every year. So they decorated graves and paid homage to dead husbands and sons and loved ones. And so this was really initially born out of grief of so many people stripped away. And it starts to grow into wanting more commemoration for not just the men who fought, but why they fought. So on Confederate Memorial Day in 1873, the Ladies Monument Association, which later becomes the United Daughters of the Confederacy, unveiled and dedicated this monument to the Confederate dead in the cemetery. Interestingly, it marks not just Confederate dead generally in Oakdale, it also marks the unmarked grave for the hundreds killed at Fort Fisher, and it actually is dedicated to all Confederate dead. So it's really just a kind of catch-all for all Confederate dead, both in Wilmington and beyond. And so on May 10th, 1873, the Ladies Association asked for local businesses to close for the day and for citizens to come out and join the celebration and decorate the graves, and many did. And so the association beforehand was talking about raising funds for this monument, not just to honor the fallen loved ones, but to fulfill a promise that they had. That, quote, we will rear a monument to which Wilmington might point with a pride commensurate with patriotism which impelled her to send forth her bravest and best beloved sons to do battle for a just cause. So that was from the association president, Julia Oakley. And they put up this monument in 1872. The dedication ceremony included a parade through town, which was led by uniformed cadets at the Cape Fear Academies, the young boys dressed in Confederate gray and gun salutes from the Wilmington Light Artillery Company. And so Major McClenny gave the address here at the monument dedication in the cemetery. And he talked in detail about the chivalry and nobility of Confederate soldiers who fought to protect their principles and their homeland. Again, we see this lost cause myth coming into play. And so they dedicate the monument out of grief, but it's an eye towards the future. That's why they have cadets leading the charge. That's why they put this monument that's going to outlive them all. It's about projecting their version, their understanding into future generations. As Oakley said, we have done this, what we have done, well, we have done what we could to rescue from oblivion and perpetuate the memory of our gallant soldiers. And so at the time, nobody really risked forgetting about this war. It's less than a decade old, or the human toil on both sides. And so a big part of the memory Oakley and others would hope that they would project into the future really goes deeper than that. It's for that just cause that she talked about this monument representing. And so, put it another way, down in Georgia around the same time, there's a Confederate veteran named Clement Evans who says, if we cannot justify the South in acts of secession, we will go down in history as solely a brave, impulsive, but rash people who attempted in an illegal manner to overthrow the union of our country. And so white Southerners told the story of this lost cause of the Old South, doomed to fail, but noble indeed. They put up monuments in hopes that future generations would see it through those eyes. We'll look at another monument. Here is one that's actually at Fort Fisher State Historic Site today, the Fort Fisher Monument, dedicated in 1932, 50 years after that one in Oakdale Cemetery. And here, Governor Gardner actually gives the dedication address. It was a big deal. They had UDC members from across the state come out. Not many veterans are alive at this time. None of the Fort Fisher veterans attend, but their children and grandchildren will come. And so Gardner actually starts to give a bit different of a speech at first. He focuses his remarks on the sacrifice of the soldiers on both sides of the battle at Fort Fisher. He said, we cannot feel but with sadness that the nation was in a sense of fighting itself, and we cannot escape a feeling of pride that Fort Fisher was both hard to take and hard to hold, because Americans, articulated by that highest sense of duty, fought on both sides. And so here we see kind of that fruition of the lost cause, where both sides are Americans, and indeed they were, both sides worthy of commemoration. But as nice as Gardner's speech was, this monument is for the Confederate soldiers specifically. There were only Confederate veterans there, only Confederate flags flying over Fort Fisher in 1932 after this ceremony. So while it's a nice talk, they are putting into place what they hope people will remember. So at the time, North Carolina's United Daughters of the Confederacy President, Mrs. Long. Side note, please, ladies, always give your actual name so you're noted in history as more than just Mrs. his name. But all we know her as is Mrs. Long. And she spoke at the dedication saying, today is the culmination for a long cherished dream, a monument at Fort Fisher. the shaft stone commanding the pilgrim to pause, to know that here was gloriously displayed the indomitable spirit of the boy soldier of the Confederacy, and to know that here a grateful people have taken pride in inscribing their history on imperishable stone. All right, so Confederate monuments have actually been built in every decade since the Civil War until this one. At least I'm not aware of any going up in the 2020s. And so by design, these commemorate a very specific view of Civil War history, one that really elevates Southern soldiers to a place of honor and respect, which perhaps they earned in nature of just fighting in a battle. But it ignores or tries to justify or skirt around the issue of slavery, the South's motivating factor for war, and indeed motivating factor for a lot of the actions that South takes after the war with Jim Crow regulations. And so from the 1870s to the 1930s and beyond, the people who built these monuments hope that we sitting here today would identify with their understanding of the past through these pieces of marble. So in other words, these monuments are, they're kind of like an Instagram selfie. They're put in the best possible light, best angle, stage, curated, everything, and ignoring the fact that I am wearing 5 pounds of makeup and picked out a dress and have a big fight with my boyfriend before I took this, and all of these baggage things we leave out of social media today. And that's what these monuments were really trying to do. And they ignored that cause for the Confederacy, that just cause they called for time and time again. They whitewashed it for the sake of white comfort over everything else. And so, I'll turn it back over to Becky.
So the Centennial and the Civil Rights Movement. In the 1960s, the centennial of the American Civil War coincided with the Civil Rights Movement. And particularly in the South, the interpretation of the Civil War was heavily influenced by the United Arts Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. While Northern newspapers would discuss the Civil War in a neutral light of sorts, while Southern newspapers reveled in the Confederacy and its glory. In 1965, it marked the 100th anniversary of the capture of Fort Fisher. A small reenactment was held in January of 1965, and later that year, the museum at Fort Fisher opened to the public. By this time, Fort Fisher was a state site as part of the Archives and History, which would later become Department of Natural Cultural Resources and blah, 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 blah. The efforts to make it part of the National Park Service had died when the new museum had opened up in August of 1965. These are a few newspaper accounts. The Gibraltar of the South, you know, it's the Charlotte Observer, shows them, quote, reenacting the battle. And this is showing you what Fort Fisher looked like in 1965, overgrown with trees still. And again, it's considered a Confederate landmark. And I think it's kind of interesting how they were still holding on to the whole Confederacy. Everything's Confederate, you know, there's no neutrality here. So it's kind of interesting looking back as a historian, like, and kind of cringing a little bit as well on this. In August of 1965, the museum at Fort Fisher, which we currently work out of, opened to the public, while the Blockade Runner Museum in Carolina Beach opened in 1965. Both focused on the Confederacy's role in the American Civil War. The Blockade Runner Museum eventually closed in 1982, and a lot of those artifacts are now down at the Cape Fear Museum. But again, as you can see, museum to honor the Confederate Navy, not just the Navy in general, both sides, it's the Confederate Navy. And then this one shows the Fort Fisher Museum dedicated in August of 1965. And again, we can rejoice in the knowledge that Fort Fisher and its splendid museum will serve the ends of education and recollection, but not the end of war. I think that's kind of interesting little tidbit right there. And again, for the longest time, our museum was driven Confederate. It wasn't until the 1990s when things started to change. The movie Glory had just come out, and a new interest in the role of Black soldiers in the Civil War emerged. The 1990 event, so the 125th anniversary of the fall of Fort Fisher, honored the role of USCPs who fought at the fort. The people who, so I was not working in historic sites at that time, I was still out in Missouri, but from what I heard, there was backlash on the staff for inviting Black troops to participate in the battle, even though they had every right to be there. So it's kind of interesting how it's slowly getting better about the acceptance of other people's history, you know, just not white history. It's Black, it's Native American, it's people from the Far East and Hawaii and so forth. You know, we're finding those stories now and we're incorporating them into our interpretation. In 1996, the Wilmington Campaign book is published, which highlighted the battles to take Wilmington, including Sugarloaf and Forks Road, which had a USCT role. The USCTs had a role there. And in recent years, with the expansion of digital content, such as archive.com and newspapers.com, have allowed historians to research more into the role of Black soldiers in the Wilmington Campaign. And we use that heavily now. And with having those resources available to us as historians, has allowed us to tell more stories. I remember I did an exhibit about the Congressional Medal of Honor. And I had people saying, well, what about the Confederate Medal of Honor? There is no such thing. And that was 5-6 years ago, to have that that pushback from people in this day and age. Are like, this is not the 60s, this is not the 1930s, this is the 2000s, and I'm getting feedback and pushback from that. And it was just like, why? It's like, it's everybody's history, and as historians, we would not be doing our job if we're not telling the whole story. History is ugly. Unfortunately, it is very ugly, but it's our job to tell their story as well. Okay.
All right. Here we go. So I'll wrap up. We're now in the 21st century. All right. And so, as Becky said, we start to reckon a little more with all this difficult history after two major events that happened in the last decade. The Charleston Massacre in 2015, where white supremacists murdered 9 Black worshipers in a Bible study at church, and the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020. These events, more than any other acts of police brutality or racism that we see pop up in our news, really asked white Americans in particular to reconcile with our history. And people have done that throughout, not just the police departments, but professionals across all sorts of different fields have done that. And historians have tried to do that as well in our field. So after these big events, perhaps way too late, it should not have taken these things. That's where we really start to see more and more attention to diverse histories and the impact of this institutionalized white supremacy that we're still fighting with in our nation today, and how we can combat that and re-examine history with the understanding of everyone's perspective, not for the sake of any tokenism, but because it really gives us a much broader understanding of everything that happened in the past. So as Becky said, right around 2015 is when you guys put in our Black History exhibit at Fort Fisher after the massacre. We had conversations about flags at museums and all these things. And then just last year, the Cameron Art Museum dedicated the Boundless sculpture by Stephen Hayes to commemorate the U.S. colored troops in the Wilmington Campaign. And a few months ago, they dedicated the U.S. Colored Troop Park, the first of its kind in the nation, to really honor U.S. colored troops, yes, here in Wilmington, but across the nation as a whole. And so Daniel Jones is the cultural curator there, will tell you people across age and racial lines really just didn't know about the role of U.S. colored troops in the Wilmington Campaign, and specifically at the Battle of Forks Road, where the art museum is. And so this monument, these stories really serve two purposes. It gives us more depth and historical understanding, and just as importantly, it allows people to see themselves in past and important roles and roles that were real. Okay, so as I hope you learned today, how we perceive the Civil War has never been static. It's been contentious. Everyone's got a slightly different view, because just like Becky said at the beginning, if I go to your Thanksgiving dinner, everyone's gonna have a slightly different perspective on how the day went. And so is our job as historians or as history enthusiasts to try and combine all of those different perspectives to really understand what happened on Thanksgiving dinner, or what happened here in the Wilmington Campaign. So that's what we do. We're like detectives. Our history, quote, changes when we have new evidence. The archival record becomes digitized. We have greater access. Or a new diary comes into public view for the first time. All these new sources, this new way of thinking, for example, after these massacres in the last murders in the last few years, gives us a new way of thinking about the world. It influences our way of thinking about the past. Not that that history was never there to begin with. Sometimes it takes a new way of approaching a problem to really crack the nut and understand it better. So we've seen these commemorations from the 1870s into the 21st century. There's a famous historian who says every generation is their own historian. So every generation tells its own history, and it's up to us to pick which part of history, which stories we choose to tell, and which ones we choose to ignore, which problems we choose to tackle, and which ones we choose to ignore. And so history is about the past, yes, but it's also about us in the present more than anything, and who we are and who we want to be, reflective in our understanding of how we got here. So with that, I will thank you guys for coming out. We do have a couple more events coming up in our Wilmington Campaign series. February 3rd, Daniel Jones leads fantastic tours of Forks Road at the Cameron Art Museum. We'll also have tours of Sugarloaf. Becky and I will be out there the weekend of February 11th. And then February 23rd, we will have our panel discussion, which I know Christine's going to talk a little bit about here in a second. Do you want me to answer questions first?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with that, if you guys have any questions, we'd be happy to answer those.
I have a question. So you mentioned that you get public pushback, and I imagine that coming from a historian perspective, they've always had public pushback about changing views on history. What do you find is the most effective way to kind of not push through that or bring anybody around your way to thinking, but kind of address that pushback and come to a more common understanding and common ground? Because I think that's what we're looking for. If you need a few minutes to think about that.
Yeah, because when the Medal of Honor exhibit came out, there were people writing to the local Carolina Beach newspaper, like basically condemn, like, why are you doing this? Why aren't you, highlighting the Confederacy? I'm like, yeah, both sides have a war. And the fact that it was the Congressional Medal of Honor, this is the current Medal of Honor that we give to our service members. And for you to question that, just kind of like, what's wrong with you? And honestly, which surprisingly enough, we haven't had any pushback from the two new exhibits we have. I helped curate an exhibit about the African American experience at Fort Fisher. And then the the folks at UNC Pembroke helped curate an exhibit about the Lumbees at Fort Fisher. So honestly, we really haven't had pushback about those two exhibits, but yet we had pushback about the Medal of Honor, which was like, but that's also changed. That's been 5 years since we did that exhibit. I think people are coming around to learning more about, it's not just white people, there are other people involved. So with our new museum that we're getting at Fort Fisher, we've been working on new topics to incorporate into our exhibits. So that's definitely going to be included as well. So
I think the biggest thing for me, and I might not have expressed it that well today, but is compassion. When you grow up in the South a couple decades ago, it's not, you probably, unless you have horrible relatives, are not growing up explicitly thinking about race and racism and supporting that. It's that, I had great-great-grandpa and he was cool and he was nice to grandpa, and these stories get passed down about what a cool guy he is. And we have this binary about race and racism, that you can't be racist if you're not also a bad person. And so I think that gets extended into history, where I can't, support my old Confederate ancestor. I can't love him without being a bad person. I don't think that binary is very helpful, nor do I think it's true. It's just having compassion in those situations and recognizing that your ancestor went through hell. Absolutely. That was hard for them. But there's another side to it too. And so firm compassion is always my stance, and you're not going to change everybody's mind. But I think, as Becky said, we've seen a lot more progress in the last few years than anything else. I think in large part because of the Charleston massacre and George Floyd's murder being so public, and a lot of white people finally, way too late, but finally really reconciling in big ways.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it
I think we kind of went off on a tangent.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions?
No, I think more of a comment, and I commend you guys really for doing this. I just think it is important. I think the African American community, well, I know the African American community, African American history has a lot of catching up to do because of what we talked about. And so doing these types of things and pushing forward with putting this out in the record, now people can go here to the public library and watch this at any time. They can get educated on this. So that's what I think is the biggest lesson from this. And I think moving forward is just people telling these stories and getting them out there to have that counterweight. And it's a counterweight, but it's a balance to try to achieve a balance, because there's a lot of work to catch up on. And so I just applaud you guys in the library, and I think everybody should be making effort to, on their own, to try to tell these stories. Just if it's a little small thing, it's big. It counts toward telling the stories. And there's lots of fantastic stories out there of the African American experience. So I look forward to the future ones that you guys do.
Yeah, like you said, Tim, education is a big part of it. I didn't learn this growing up, therefore why is it different now? Especially with our lackluster history education we have, where it's just facts and dates and big names more than anything. I think when that suddenly changes, well, how can a date and a fact change? And so it trips people up more than anything when all these perspectives come in. We have to take the step back. That's why I like to use the Thanksgiving dinner metaphor a lot. I find it really helpful for some people.
I think the last thing I want to say is that I think it really is, again, you just don't know what people don't know and what their experiences have been. I'm a guy from the north that just moved down here to the south.
Midwest, right? From the Midwest. Midwest.
I'm from the Midwest, but
You're from the Midwest.
I'm across that Mason-Dixon line that's out there. And again, I say it's a collective effort. I was a former teacher. It's lifelong learning. Everybody should really want to learn
Okay.
about different events and things. And when I think about, when we think about the North and the South, like I say, I was in the North, and there was still racism in the North. The school I was in at the time I was coming through there, this is the 70s, you know, they had just, my dad and others were marching around the school in protest because there wasn't an African-American history class there. So that was the steps we were taking in the 70s to try to move forward and to try to educate a little bit. So I was a beneficiary of that, but that was just a little small piece. And if I hadn't then been inspired by that, which I was, and then I ended up, you know, the things I'm learning here, the things you taught me today is a part of the lifelong learning process, which I hope we can instill in more people, just to, you know, go find your history and go discover it. You know, don't think that, you know, you have to go to college to learn it, or I've learned enough and there's nothing else to learn. So
I think just the access to records,
absolutely.
that becoming more accessible to people, because I'm showing my age here, but when I was in college in the 90s, you know, the internet was just coming around. Things were not digitized yet. You had to go to National Archives. You had to go to that archive and research it. Now you can just type it in, stuff's coming up. It's great for us researchers. I will tell you that. And especially during COVID, you know, I was able to, they had just released the Confederate slave payroll records. So I was able to find over 100 names of men who were at Fort Fisher and more information that can help us with our interpretation at our site. So, you know, I've been doing this for 25 years now, and just seeing how technology has advanced the research and allowing people to get more information out there has been very helpful for us. So now we can tell more stories, and instead of just keeping it the same plain old, you know, story that they've had since the 60s. No, we want to incorporate more stories, telling more stories, making people feel more included. So that's my job, and that's Kaitlin's job, and you know.
You did a good job.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Doesn't have to be so deep. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Christine.
Wonderful. I have one little bit of conclusion and all right. Kaitlin, Becky, thank you so much for that presentation. It was engaging and interesting, and really, you know, these are the things that the public library wants to be involved with, and that this is where our role is to help get this information out and make it accessible to everyone. This is just a part in the larger series of Dwell with Gratitude and Pride. Our final program in this series will be Thursday, February 23rd. At 5:30 here in this room, where it'll be a panel of local historians to discuss the experiences of the diverse people involved in the Wilmington Campaign. The panelists will provide summaries of key battles and biographies of the people in the military conflict. It's a great opportunity to see how the battles at Fort Fisher, Sugarloaf, Forks Road, and Fort Anderson interplay. Conversation topics range from common battle-specific questions to big themes like weaponry and reconstruction. A moderator will guide the discussion, but audience members are welcome to come and ask questions of their own. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you all in the future, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Can I get a brochure?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're on